So welcome to our clients and friends around the world. My name is Dennis Stearns with Stearns Financial, and we have another one of our interesting talks with interesting people and interesting times. Today we have a particularly interesting person, Mark Sanborn, an old friend, and Mark has a remarkable background. Many of you saw that on the intro information that we had. That he has been a leadership expert, written a number of different books on leadership, national, international, keynote speaker on the topic, one of the top 5 gurus of the known universe, or maybe it's just the planet, I don't know, in 2019 in leadership. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks, Dennis. Interesting, is that a euphemism for odd? Because my wife sometimes says I'm interesting, so I'm just curious.
Yeah, well, interesting has many connotations, right? And the old Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. And I think what we're going to talk about today, definitely interesting times. So, I mean, let's get right into it. What do you think is going to be the time frame, or what is it going to look like to get back to normal?
Well, first, I don't think we're ever going to get back to normal, because normal never lasts long enough to really become normal. 10 years ago, pundits started talking about the new normal, and I always hated that phrase for the simple reason that if you're a leader and you think you know what's normal, you become complacent and you quit being vigilant and you get caught flat-footed. I think leaders have to be continually defining normal as whatever happens next. And, I heard Mark Cuban interviewed recently, and I liked his phraseology. They said to Mark, when do you think it will get back to normal? And he said, I don't think it will. I think we're living in the age of the new abnormal. And I know that sounds a little odd, but I think it's a good way to stay vigilant and agile, which are the two things right now that are going to help lead us out of not only COVID-19 as we're coming out of that crisis, but whatever other crises that leaders face in the days, weeks, months, and years ahead.
Yeah, well, we're working with a number of companies right now, and the agile piece, everybody's talking about it, how to actually put it into play when you have multiple opportunities and multiple threats coming at you at the exact same time is a wonderful challenge. So what do you think some of the biggest challenges are for leaders?
Well, the one thing that makes any leader crazy, and most people in general, it's a lack of certainty. One of the things I've noticed, and it really became clear during COVID-19, is that it's a matter of just pick your facts, pick your opinions, right? One doctor says, we don't need to do any of this and we'll be fine. Another doctor says, if we don't shelter in place, we're all going to die. And I'm only being slightly facetious, because on the same day, you'll see 180-degree conflicting reports. And so I think one of the biggest challenges for leaders is going to be not how to access information. It's easier than ever to access information. It's how to assess it for validity and for relevance. And I also think that leaders need to understand that no matter how hard they try, they're not going to get it all right. And that is something you got to come to terms with, because if you evaluate your leadership effectiveness on your sense of clairvoyance and your ability to get it all right, you're going to be woefully disappointed. See, that's what agility does. Agility says you act on what you think is the correct information. And if it turns out not to be the correct information or the correct action, you switch it up, you modify it, you do it differently, you stop doing it, you do something entirely differently. And that's the agility piece. So, certainty, a lack of it, crazy maker for me. In a book that I wrote back in 2010, which if you think about it, had a few similarities, a really big global recession, and most businesses took a setback. I had an extra piece of a challenge. I've been diagnosed with cancer. And so I had kind of the trifecta of challenges. But having said that, I felt fairly optimistic. And one of the reasons was I had built a lot of reserves, financial reserves, spiritual reserves, health reserves. And I know you can't build reserves instantly. You can't build, today's reserves unless you started yesterday. But having said that, going forward, right now, in more practical or more gauche terms, cash is king. Going forward, I think leaders are going to be much more aware of the importance of building and maintaining reserves because, eventually it's going to rain, and sometimes it's a monsoon. It's not just a rainstorm. And I think for at least the last 2 to 3 months, we've been in a bit of a monsoon.
Well, and so that's a really interesting point. So we've got a number of clients where we've been working with them, closely held businesses predominantly, some public, and there's some of the senior team, particularly maybe the CFO, in a little bit more of a scarcity mentality approach of, we got to maintain safety reserves for whatever happens. And then some parts of the leadership team saying, well, wait a minute, we have these opportunities. We have things we can lean into. And the CEO is getting hit from both sides of that. And so how do you sort some of that out?
Well, I've developed a statistically valid algorithm, and for $999.95, no postage and handling, I'll be glad to sell that. That's what we'd all like. We'd like that kind of mathematical modeling, but ultimately intuition plays into it. And I think it goes back. I know that different people have different risk tolerances, but I always like to point to the mountain climber. Good mountain climbers do not take risks. They manage risk. And there's a big difference. Me climbing more than 30 feet in the air without safety equipment is a big risk because I'm likely to fall. And at 30 feet or so, you can do some serious, if not permanent damage. So a mountain climber knows their skill set, and they might be able to go 30 feet before they start putting in their safety rigging because they know they have the skill not to fall. And so I think it goes back to, what are your reserves? And what is your risk for what is your tolerance for risk management? No good leader ever bets the entire company when other people are dependent on the bet. If it's your own money, then it's up to you. But if it's other people's livelihoods, I can see, I guess maybe because I'm older, I guess our view of things change over time. But I always err towards the side of cautious. But at the same time, like you, Dennis, I've been advising my clients on a professional level and at a personal level. I've been working with my financial managers to look for those opportunities that really are rare. I mean, they're rare in general, and they've presented themselves now.
Yep. Yeah. Well, so there's a good question. In the midst of the fog of uncertainty of where we are right now, the tendency for some people is to err on the side of caution. Mm-hmm. For some people to be looking more for the opportunities. Does this feel different, or more the same as 0809?
I think the difference between 08 and 09 and now is that we had a lot, it was a lot similar to other economic pullbacks. There are new factors, for instance, there's two things that come to mind. Nassim Taleb, who wrote, the Black Swan and some other interesting books. He says a black swan is something that's either very difficult to predict or prepare for. And the black swan of COVID, as one other writer in the Wall Street Journal pointed out, wasn't the pandemic, because we knew that there have been pandemics before. Go back to 1918. That wasn't the black swan. The black swan was how we responded to it. This is the first time in history we've quarantined healthy people. And I think that the first black swan is how we responded to the medical challenge. The second black swan is going to be how consumers respond to this. And of course, consumer behavior is a major driver in the market. So until we can get a sense of consumers' willingness, not just to spend money, but to find ways they can spend money and feel safe and secure. It used to just be about dollars and cents. Now it's about dollars and cents and health and well-being. So that's what I think is the difference. We just have some new unknowns that we didn't have back then. Having said that, I think, the fundamentals of the market haven't changed. Although, I don't know, Dennis, do you find it interesting that Warren Buffett, who taught us all to buy on on fear and sell on greed, just sold all of his airline stocks, which I don't think I'll ever get a chance to ask him one-on-one, but I would like him to reconcile his philosophy with dumping all of his airline stocks at what looks to me to be the bottom of their valuations. And I'm kind of
yes, go ahead.
Get excited there. I felt like Welcome Back Kotter, but I don't know if your listeners are old enough to remember Horshack and Welcome Back Kotter. Nassim Taleb has informed my view of investing, and I think you can use it with your company potentially. And that is, he says 90% should be, rational, fairly low risk appreciation of your portfolio, and 10% should be swing for the fences. And I like that because that's how I allocate our portfolio. 90% stocks, bonds, basic tried and true asset allocation. But startups and early stage ventures and real estate, that's my other 10%. And the good news is, even if all of that 10%, and I've hedged by investing it in a lot of different things, even if all of it disappeared, you've still got 90% of your corpus. So I think that's a reasonable, that doesn't bet your security, your future, your well-being, and there might be a way for leaders to apply that to their company as well.
Well, that's interesting because, we do have a core and explore philosophy. And so some of our clients, again, 90% seems to be a typical number. Some of them, maybe it's 80%. And then they have 20% in an explore category. But even there, is it mundane explore or hyper explore? Is it, early stage startups, or is it just things that have been beaten down that probably have a pretty good chance of making good money over the next 3 to 5 years?
Well, I still think blue chips have the most potential to come back, with the exception of a few industries that we might have discovered we didn't need nearly as much as we thought we did.
Oh, okay. Well, now that's an interesting comment. What industries do we not need as much as we thought we might have?
Well, I think higher education is going to be challenging. Our mutual friend, Dr. Nito Kubain, and I'm honored to be the leadership expert in residence at High Point University. He's as sharp and clever a leader as I know. He's leading edge. And one of the things that High Point has emphasized is life skill development. Now, if you're a typical university where you're just offering academic knowledge, really, other than the social aspect, there is not a big reason to go to campus, is there? I mean, it might not be as fun to do it online, but it's a lot cheaper and it takes a lot less time. In my opinion, and this isn't because of some secret conversation I had with Dr. Kubain, when you teach life skills, that requires your presence, because skills can't be taught abstractly. And so I think a lot of universities are going to have the first challenge of, what is it that requires a student to come to campus? And if the answer is not much, they're going to have to shift to digital learning. Having said that, if you switch to digital learning, how do you create loyalty among alumni, and how do you facilitate networking, which of course is one of the benefits of going to college? I think it's potentially a matter of creating city directors. In the sales world, we'd call them sales managers. But I think universities that have, let's say, their student body in 40 or 50 main metropolitan areas will have a coordinator in each of those areas to facilitate bringing students together that are mostly online into a digital, or into a real world interaction, whether it's limited to 50 or 5, and be able to do those things again at a distance that used to require getting on an airplane, flying across the country. My oldest son just graduated from Ohio State, was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Marines last weekend. Both of those things were done virtually. We saw him, we saw the ceremony, but we weren't there. And I think it bothered mom and dad a lot more than it bothered him, because he'd already been through one graduation. He knew what graduation was like in high school, and I'm glad for him. I still think that, it would have been better if that hadn't been the case. But, he's resilient. And frankly, to him, it was about the end of education and the beginning of a new journey.
Yeah. Very good. So let's circle back for a second to consumers, because you have some pretty interesting clients, and I'm guessing you're having pretty interesting conversations every single day with the leaders of many of the large companies of America that are trying to figure out that, what is the consumer going to look like going forward? What are some of the takeaways from all that?
Well, first, people say, what are consumers going to want post-COVID? They're going to want the same thing they wanted pre-COVID, and that is their lives to be better. They want to be more successful. Now, that's a big umbrella. But one of the things that I talked about in my latest book, The Intention Imperative, is that we've got to go from designing for experience to designing for emotion. It's not the experience you have, it's how you feel about it. If you place a to-go order today, and the kitchen the to-go order comes from is immaculate, it's like a surgical center, and the deliverer, the packager, and the deliverer of the food is the most cautious in the world. If you don't feel good about it, you're still going to be reticent to place that order or to order again. So one of the big emotions going forward we're going to have to come to terms with is security and safety. Now, people have always wanted to be safe and secure, but I don't think it's ever been as real and raw as it is, right now. So you say to the restaurant business, what's that going to mean for our physical locations? We have ghost kitchens. Ghost kitchens make delivery food for restaurants that have no physical presence, or that their physical presence is closed down. And people order from, Mark's restaurant, and I've contracted with a ghost kitchen with my recipes to fulfill those orders. Now, Texas Roadhouse, a friend of mine, and they're a client of mine. A friend of mine has 10 stores in his supervision. He's got a store in Parker, Colorado, that doing carryout was able to match monthly sales as pre-COVID. And that's pretty extraordinary. And a lot of people in the restaurant business would say you can't do that. Now, let me acknowledge the margins are different. The margins aren't as good, believe it or not, on carryout. You would think perhaps, with less labor, but you got packaging and a lot of other costs. Well, he did it out of just tenacity and idea sharing throughout the Texas Roadhouse system. They all shared great ideas. They basically, when there was a challenge, they tackled it simultaneously. And this particular operator has been very successful at delivery and matching sales in a store that had an hour wait on most days of the week. So it can be done, and it probably really makes people mad who aren't doing it, but that doesn't change the fact.
Well, and so that's been a theme of a number of these chats, actually, is innovation and creativity are just going off the charts in a lot of different areas. We had a session a few weeks back on telemedicine, and oh my goodness, they were talking about 10 years of innovation in 1 year, and we had two of the top experts in that area prognosticating about the future. So give us some more examples: creativity, innovation, we had one person who was the author of Plato, how Plato made lemons out of lemonade. I just botched up the name of that book, but anyway, give us some more examples of that.
Well, Plato should have used his lemons to make a bourbon smash. It would have been even better. But
that's a good title for a book, right there.
Well, I've been researching it for years, so I'm ready to write it. I don't know what it'll be about. I think that this is going to be a new entrepreneurial renaissance. It's going to be a golden age. And again, we were forced into it. I'm not a happy talk guy. I would never say, oh, I'm so glad this happened. No, I'm no gladder this happened, and I'm glad that I get sick or that a loved one suffers. But God puts you into the course, and you got to decide if you're going to learn or languish. And so right now we are being forced to innovate, which is why if you were an innovation speaker, you talk to 1,000 people in an audience, and you hope 5% of them would take your ideas and do something with them, because the other 95% said, oh, that was fun, and they went home and did business as usual. Well, suddenly circumstance is forcing you to innovate for survival. And by the way, the most dangerous person you have on your team right now, if you're in leadership, is a leader that's close to retirement. Make sure he or she is committed to changing going forward, because a lot of people, they may not say it out loud, but they've decided, I've only got a year or two, I'm just going to coast. You can't afford coasters right now. You never really could afford them, but now you've got to get people to be honest, and they either got to stay on board and do the work, or they need to take early retirement, because you can't afford the drag on leaders that are not fully committed. What would happen, Dennis? Now, I'm not a scientist, and I'll prove this by what I'm about to say, but I know certain kinds of light, I believe UV light, kills germs. It has been tested in restaurants. Whenever I go to Phoenix, when I'm in a restaurant, sitting on the patio, it's so bloody hot, they've got misters, and that's water coming out of the misters, right? Well, what would happen if there was something in those misters that disinfected the air around you and your table and your hands, didn't have any harm to the human being or to the food. Whether that or UV light or something like it that can be used to give that security, not just the sense of security, but to create security, that would make somebody or whomever gets it to market first a fortune. Then you got the little things. One of my investment firms did something that I thought was so cool. It had nothing to do with investments. They sent us clients all a free membership to masterclass.com. I think the hard cost, if you or I joined, is $190 a year, but it's classes taught by the top experts in the world, you know, on everything from script writing to music and to chess. And the thought was really nice. They said, you know, you're going to be sheltering at home. You're going to have more free time than you've had before. This is addictive and it's educational. Enjoy on us. Dairy Queen sent out a printable PDF for kids to color, you know, when this hit and all the kids were at home and mom and dad were pulling their hair out. And of course, the coloring PDF had their products to remind the toddlers or the kids that when they did go out again, they needed to go to Dairy Queen. So there's little things, and those little things by themselves aren't going to save you. But when you do enough of those little things and you couple them with those really big innovations, that's the way forward.
I was going to say, you were sounding a little bit like Mark Cuban there for a minute.
I'm a big fan of Mark Cuban. He's quite a clever guy. I don't agree with that. You know, it's so funny. I don't agree with everything Mark Cuban says, but my wife doesn't agree with everything I say, and she loves me. So I don't know why, you know, we live in an age where when people disagree, they instantly polarize and attack. I'm actually learn as much from my opponents as I do my allies.
All right, well, let's delve into that a little bit because, you know, I think there was some thought process that the pandemic would bring us closer together. And we actually, in our live chat this morning, talked about some of the places where that's really happening. We have some phenomenal serving kids who are low income food and different things that are going on in the state of North Carolina. And that's going on in almost every state now. So there are some of those things going on, but there's also a lot of people being very divided about the data and what's the real data and the politics and all of that. And so I don't know how far you want to get on this conversation, but with your friends who you agree to disagree with, how do you handle some of that conversation?
You know, the dividing line is when a disagreement of opinion becomes personal. I've taught for 30 years, you know, attack the problem, not the person. You know, have a spirited conversation about the issue and use data and do more than say you believe it because you feel it. You know, some days I feel like I might be an alien and I know pretty sure I'm not. I think that's the big problem. But here's the interesting thing about crisis, Dennis. Not only can crisis unify it identifies us. And I wrote a blog about 3 weeks ago that said, it's been said that a crisis develops character. True, more often than not, though, it reveals it. In other words, whatever character you had going into this crisis, under pressure was revealed. Now, I'm sure some people developed more character over the last 8, 10, 12 weeks, but initially, when you were squeezed like the lemon, what came out was lemon juice. What was inside is what came out. And so I think we see where when people are pressured, unless they can, and this is what I think is the big change. Historically, things like this, we pretty much agreed with the data and what to do. Now we can't agree on the data and therefore we can't agree what to do. So you got the people that say your liberties are being impinged by a tyranny. You've got other people saying, no, this is about being considerate enough not to accidentally kill your neighbors or your friends because you didn't shelter in place long enough. So I think it's like Dickens said, you know, it was the best of times and it was the worst of times. It's both.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and so let's get back to your latest book. And there are 3 main topics in the book. Have we hit on all 3?
Have we? Well, no, not directly. The first, you know, I talk about 3 shifts that leaders need to make. And this was pre-COVID, and COVID hadn't changed it. It might change the application, but it hadn't changed the principle. The first shift is from experience to emotion. The second shift is from organization to culture. Organization is a structure. Culture is a pervasive quality. It's the sum of everything people think and believe that results in what they do and achieve. And so culture has been tested during this. I have a friend who works for a company that manages multi apartment properties around the United States. And early on, one of the managers threw a mutiny and said that he and his team weren't going to come into work. They were basically going to leave the apartment complex unmanned because of COVID. And my friend said to me, he said, the real satisfaction is going to be when we finally get that covered and we can fire them all without ceremony. Because, there are just certain things that in that culture you don't do. And mutiny is one of them. Matter of fact, I don't know many cultures where mutiny is rewarded. And so culture is about your values, about your philosophy, about your training and education. It's not just what people do, but how they do it and why they do it. So we've got to get much better on identifying and designing our culture rather than just accepting it by default. And the final thing is from motivation to inspiration. I've been advising clients, what are the things they need to be doing is keeping their people focused on their larger purpose, not just their tactical challenges. Why are you doing it? Not just what are the tough things you have to do, but why? Not just profit and market share, but the ability to pursue philanthropy, to keep your kids in college, put food on the table. And so that's a shift from motivation to inspiration. And here's how I define inspiration. Inspiration is motivation to the power of purpose. Motivation is carrot and stick. It's a reward. People like to be rewarded. But especially millennials and the generation that comes after them, 87% of millennials said they'd rather do work that matters than be recognized by their employer. And that's a really cool thing because, I'm a baby boomer. And I used to tell people, you pay a baby boomer enough, we'll sell our souls, right? For us, it was all about the money. And so I like that we have an idealistic workforce that says, yeah, I want to be rewarded, but I also want to do something that matters. And so I think especially during COVID-19 and post-COVID-19, inspiration is going to be very important.
Great stuff. And so we actually have a question from one of our business leader folks watching. What would be the way to engage with employees who are watching a lot of cable TV and other news, getting a lot of gloom and doom kind of information, but keeping them realistic? And so I think we had talked about previously, we had shared the Stockdale paradox with our audience, keeping them realistic, but hopeful, and keeping those two things, for a leader is one thing, but doing that in the folks that are working for you, the average Fred. And I use that term because one of Mark's famous books is called The Fred Factor, is pretty tough. So tell us what you think about that.
Well, let me riff on that just a little bit, both practical and philosophical. And the first is one of the worst bits of advice that I've heard leaders giving out during COVID is to over-communicate. Over-communication is never a good idea. We're already overwhelmed with information. You don't have to over-communicate. You've got to communicate better. You've got to be concise. You've got to be relevant. You've got to have a call to action so that whether it's a text or an email or a phone call, when your team member sees it, they're going to go, it's important, or they wouldn't be bothering me. Over-communication is just a shotgun approach to solving the wrong problem. I think that two things. One, leaders should communicate. You know what? One of my primary jobs is right now to be as well informed and even better informed than our competition. I want you to think for yourself. I want you to watch the news and draw your own conclusions. But just know that we're working overtime to cut through the clutter and find the information that's most relevant to our business. Because I don't think most followers realize that's the job of leadership, is to be well informed, to make good decisions. I think the second thing, and this might sound a little weird, is you got to give especially if you're still working remotely, you got to give people projects. You've got to chunk down some measurable, actionable things they can do from their remote space for two reasons. One is lacking projects, they'll become lethargic. In other words, I would rather have too much to do than be bored to tears. And I'm not saying overwhelm your people, but work individually to say, what are you working on? Here's what I need you to do. And you might have to think a little harder, but give them projects to keep them focused and from becoming lethargic. And here's the second thing. It'll improve morale. I think morale suffers when we feel like we're sitting on our hands and we're not accomplishing anything. And I guess I'd bring that full circle back to, what is your greater purpose in your respective organization? And, tying those projects to what greater good it'll serve. But it is tough. It's tougher to engage remotely, I believe. Maybe not as that much tougher. Frankly, a lot of companies I know couldn't engage people that sat in the cubicle next to them. So I think, sometimes we use that as a straw man, right? Well, they're remote. It's harder to engage them. I'm not so sure about that.
Well, yeah, and we have been hearing a lot of people say that because of Microsoft Teams and Zoomcasts and a variety of other things, sometimes they're actually communicating better than they were back in the old days, which again makes for an interesting question of what the new abnormal will really look like of work from company to company.
I think it'll be more structural than philosophical. And I simply mean it's going to, I think, just as we learned that distance learning can be done online. By the way, if you have kids at home, I don't think distance learning is going to be embraced. I think mom and dad want to make sure the kiddies go to grade school and middle school and high school. But, we've also learned that maybe this idea of coming into a big office space that we lease or own isn't as important as we once thought it was. We were moving that direction, but we just, picked up the pace by a factor of 2 or 3. But ultimately, people have the same hopes, fears, and desires. Those haven't changed. I always tell people, you've got your core skill set. The only thing that changes is the context. Like for me, my favorite thing, what I got paid the most to do over 33 years is stand in front of a big group and talk. Have fun, but educate at the same time. I'm temporarily unemployed, and I don't know if and when we're going to go back to that big meeting model. So I say to myself, well, what's my core? I'm pretty good on stage, but my core is my expertise. So got a lot of ways to distribute it, pre-recorded, Zoom, GoToWebinar, phone calls. And so it's the context has changed, but then there's a third. If you think in circles, core, context, the third is how do you monetize it? And I think that to me is going to be the most fascinating question in a lot of professional services is, how are we going to go about monetizing things that used to be easier to measure when people showed up in person?
So one of our listeners wants to know, what's your big dream, what you want to try to do in the next 5 years?
Well, my big dream, and this, I don't want to sound maudlin, I really love giving people ideas. My mother was a teacher, my grandmother was a teacher, and I've never taught in public school. But I guess really my big thrill is giving people ideas that they can use to improve their business or their life for 2 reasons. It's a double-edged sword. These are ideas that I've tested in my own work, my own businesses, my own leadership roles. I try to be a practitioner, not an abstract kind of an academic. But secondly, when you find something that works for you and you can share it with somebody else and it works for them, that's pretty gratifying. Now, where I draw, and frankly, at my age, the next 5 years, I'd be happy to keep doing that in whatever format works best for me to do it. Because there's got to be an intersection between what you can do and what you want to do. And for me, at this phase of my life, I built enough reserves that I don't have to do everything I don't want to do. I can be a little more selective. Having said that, though, I think that we got to come to terms with the fact that it's about the impact that we have on people. That's what we're remembered for. Nobody can tell you after you die what your net worth was or how many awards you won or what year you were salesman of the year. It's how you affected them, whether you helped them or not. And I'm always very clear with my readers and the kind people that occasionally will approach me after a speech and say, your book or your speech changed my life. Thank you, but no, it didn't. I couldn't get my kids to take out the garbage when they lived at home. I can't change your life. You changed your life. Now, thank you that my book gave you ways and some inspiration and some ideas to do that, but change is a personal job, and My profession is full of people that think they're out there changing lives and get up in the morning to change lives. No, I get up in the morning to give people ideas they can use. And if they change their life for the better, that's great.
Great. Well, Mark, we're at the end of our time here, but you have been phenomenal, as I knew you would be. And I'm sure that our listeners have picked up at least a nugget or two or five that'll help them through this. And frankly, we need more people like you, inspirational, to be out there talking and helping us through all this.
Well, thank you. It's been great to be with you, Dennis. Always good to connect.
Yep. And so just a reminder to our audience, this has been recorded. It will be available on our SFG YouTube live streaming, as well as Monday. You will get the link to the tape itself. We will also provide a link to Mark's blog. So if you want to get things direct from the teacher, the idea maker, you can do that as well. And I did remember the name of the book. It's Plato's Lemonade Stand by Tom Morris. So,
oh, I love Tom Morris. I haven't read, I read a book of his many years ago, so that must be a new book, I assume.
it is a new book, and a copy of it is on its way to you as a thank you.
Thank you. That's great.
Yeah, no, we had Tom Morris on here, and he talked about how in Plato's time, first of all, they were going through way worse things than we're going through today, and how the greatest change tended to happen during the time that we all hated to have to go through the change. So you had the same theme, so thanks.
Well, it rings true. Thanks.
Modern day Plato. Thank you, Mark.
Yeah.